This video will show the major steps in tearing down the tail shaft and top cover of a T5 transmission. This is a non-world class transmission that I rebuilt. You'll notice something very different. This has a Astrovan tail housing here. The shifter box is here. The S10 shifter box would normally be about right here, but this is still sort of in the forward position, good for a bench seat. The Camaro tail housing is about here. The procedure is the same for all T5 transmissions. With the transmission shifter in neutral, use a 13mm socket to remove these bolts. Now we can take a look inside. Inside the shifter box you will find a few things. You'll find the offset lever, which is the mechanism used to move the shift rod. You'll see a roll pin here, and you'll see a detent plate down below. We will take that area apart. You're now going to use a drift and a ball peen hammer to drive this roll pin down. You do not want to drive it down so hard that it jams against the detent plate. You just want to get it to go down. Next, you will use a 15mm socket to remove 8 bolts from the tail housing that bolt it to the case. When it's a dirty old transmission, I find that an air impact wrench is very useful. These 8 bolts, 15mm. You're going to now loosen this with a rubber mallet or a dead blow hammer just to kind of break the seal around here. You're going to make sure that's loose. Tap it a couple of times, make sure it's loose. And then you're going to take a drift and a ball peen, and you're going to knock this. As you knock it loose towards the tail, you'll be able to begin to move this tail housing away from the case. And you're just going to work it off little by little until it comes loose. So now we have some parts that you need to keep track of. You have your offset lever, you have a roll pin, and in this case the roll pin dropped out of the lower hole, but yours may have stayed inside. Make sure you remove that and you keep track of it. You'll have a large heavy-duty spring inside the bottom of the offset lever, and you'll have a ball bearing down here in the detent plate. Keep those in a little baggie for later use when you put it back together. So a couple of things go into the bag: your spring, your offset lever, the ball bearing, and the roll pin. Also inside the offset lever is a plastic cup. Yours may or may not be in good shape. That's a fairly important piece to avoid wear from the shift lever. That may need to be replaced if yours is heavily worn. That can be pried out of there, but we can work on that later. Now that you've removed the shifter box parts and put them into a baggie, you can remove the tail housing. The tail housing just simply slides off, and set it down carefully. Some parts may fall out. We will talk about what they are. Inside the tail housing is a race and a bearing, and that is for the counter shaft. there's the race, and in this case the bearing has stuck onto the end of the counter shaft here. What you should do is put those two together and put them in a bag. I'm going to put them in the same baggie with my offset lever. You can now set your tail housing aside in a safe place. We are now looking at a transmission case that has the shift lever, the 5th gear on the counter shaft, and the 5th gear on the main shaft. We have the fork for the slider, and that slider engages 5th gear, and on the inside of the case will cause reverse to engage. So this is the 5th gear slider here, and the fork for shift of reverse and 5th gear. Now we're going to remove the lid. The lid has these 10mm bolts. This one here and this one here, kind of in the corners, are bolts with a shoulder. The other bolts are just normal threads. A couple of things to look for on your transmission case. There is a slot cut out at the corner here and over on this other corner opposite. That slot is ideal for a screwdriver to be inserted and twisted for a little bit of prying action or wedge action to lift the lid to break the seal. But I'm going to remove these 10 bolts. You can now take a screwdriver or some sort of wedge. Don't use a lot of force, but if you push it in underneath here, it will pry the lid up. There's a wedge place for a wedge on this corner and on this one back here as well. So that should give you, I would not try and hammer in from the edges around here. You might gall the edge. Okay, now to remove the cover is pretty simple. You slide the cover away from you and then lift. Again, with it lined up, the tail housing is to your right, the input shaft is to your left. You're just simply, once you break the seal, you're going to push it about an inch towards or away from you, and then you're going to lift. You'll then tilt it up and see that the shift forks are there, and they just came up off the insides of the transmission. You've now lifted off the case cover, and you can inspect the transmission. Some general inspection things. These little pads on the end of the forks need to be in good condition. Those pads ride on the sliders, and it's important that they not be worn out. There's also a set of pads on the 5th gear slider fork as well. Make sure those are in good condition. Those can be replaced. If the shift fork is cracked or damaged, you're going to have to find a replacement shift fork, and then that's pretty much it. Inspect and then clean the surfaces that go together for the lid and the case, and then the case and the tail housing. Use a green Scotch pad to get off all the RTV. Clean it out with some you know, I don't know, solvent of some sort, and get it nice and clean. Let's take a little closer look at this transmission. So the tail shaft is over on the right, the input shaft is on the left, and 1st gear is here. This is the 1-2 slider, and 2nd gear is here. 3rd gear, and then the input shaft, which is 4th gear. Down inside is the counter shaft. That is one solid block of metal. Those gears all turn simultaneously. So when the transmission is shifting, the shift fork, which is holding onto the slider, moves it this direction and locks it onto 1st gear. Then when you shift into 2nd, the shift fork pulls it off of 1st gear, moves it over and locks it onto 2nd gear. 3rd gear, same way. It locks it onto 3rd gear, or then it locks the slider onto the input shaft. Of course, 5th gear has a different shift fork here, which engages the slider down here onto this gear and locks it on so that you're in 5th gear. You'll notice this is a non-world class transmission. These are brass synchronizer rings here and here, and then here and here. In a world class version, these synchros would be fiber lined, so they would look different. They would not have that brass color. 5th gear down here, no matter if it's world class or non-world class, is always a brass synchronizer ring. Further steps to take this transmission apart can be done for additional inspection. However, that will not be covered in this video. To clean this transmission, it is possible to shove a rag down in this bigger opening here. There is a magnet down there. You can see the little clip holding onto the magnet. And you can get some cleaning fluid down in here. If it's a non-world class, you can use any solvent that you choose and it will be fine. Take care not to get your rag stuck on the gears, or you'll have trouble with getting the rag out, but you can clean up in there quite nicely. This one has already been cleaned. We're now going to take off the bearing retainer and remove the input shaft. This is a step that's necessary for the Jeep shaft swap, and if you already have the case open, now is the perfect time to do it. To help you remember how this goes back on, mark this boss here. It's a rounded boss. This is at the 12 o'clock position. There is another boss down here which is wider and more squared corners. That is at the 6 o'clock position. That's important for putting this back together. We're now going to use a 13mm socket and remove these 4 bolts. Then you're going to knock it with a rubber mallet to break the RTV sealant and slide it off. This has now been loosened with a rubber mallet so that it will slide off. It simply slides off. Inside you will find some interesting things. You will find a bearing race. If you remove the race, you will find a shim beneath the race that brings it up to the proper end play. And then there's a rubber seal here. It's important that if you're going to do all of this trouble, you might as well replace that rubber seal. Sometimes they're in good shape, but it's such a cheap thing to do and you already have it apart. So this small area is going to allow the fluid to soak in to this area, and then it's going to escape. So this is at the 12 o'clock, this is at the 6 o'clock, and there's the rounded boss, and there's the squared off boss. Looks like my shim and my race have come out all by themselves. Very nice.